telescope by hand once they're up at the top of those cables. And it takes 10 to 12 years to put one full coat of paint on the GBT, and then they start back at square one after that. So it's a never-ending job. We condense maintenance down to only 4 months out of the year, so between June and September. And throughout the summertime, we have about a 10-person paint crew. 4 days a week they'll come in and they'll actually work on painting the telescope. Alrighty, so if you can think back and remember in your mind the Tadel telescope, the first operational telescope here at Green Bank, we saw that one already. We'll have two others that are actually identical to that one. So coming up on our left right now, we have the 85-3, and further down the field beyond it is the 85-2. It's going to be off in the distance. Our road doesn't go up next to the 85-2, but that's okay if you can't see it closely because it's exactly like the 85-3, which is also exactly like the Tadel telescope. Now the reason why we built three identical telescopes and set them up in a straight line was to create an interferometer. And basically an interferometer is just multiple telescopes working together to act like one bigger telescope. And they were operated together out of the small brick building that's on our left right now. This was the first interferometer that was built in the history of radio astronomy, and it was actually the prototype for interferometry. That's because during the 1960s, when astronomers were thinking up this idea, they thought, well, if we could get multiple telescopes to observe the same thing at the same time, they could put their data together and create a higher resolution data set because each telescope was observing from a slightly different position. It sounded really good in theory, they just needed to know whether it would actually hold up in practice. Turns out it did hold up in practice. It was a very successful project, and the Green Bank interferometer here was involved in lots of different projects. You can read about some of those projects on our timeline that's in the Science Center hallway. But one of the most notable discoveries of the Green Bank interferometer is that there is, at the center of our Milky Way galaxy, a supermassive black hole called Sagittarius A, which previously we did not even know existed until we ran the Green Bank interferometer. So after this was successful, the green light was given for the VLA to be built out in Socorro, New Mexico, and that stands for Very Large Array. That is a good name for that facility out there because instead of 3 telescopes like we have in our little interferometer, they have 29 telescopes that will stretch out for miles in the desert out there. So very cool state-of-the-art facility as well. Alright, on the left we have one more brick building. It's out at the end of the road, and there's an empty field between us and the building. Now that building was the operating building for the 300-foot telescope, which actually used to be here, but it's no longer with us. It used to stand in that empty field between us and the brick building. The 300-foot telescope actually collapsed in 1988, so we do not have it anymore. Now that was the only telescope that has fallen down in the history of our site. There were several public opinions around that time that maybe telescopes aren't such a safe research tool if they're just going to go falling down on people. Well, the caveat to that line of reasoning is that the 300-foot telescope was only supposed to have a 5-year lifespan. We ran it for 26 years, so it was way past its expiration date, and by all rights, it should have fallen down long before it did. When it collapsed, it did fall right on top of our operating building, and our operator was inside when that happened. Now, he was okay. He did take about 10 years off, but he's back with us now. We like to exaggerate that story, but actually he claims that he had no idea the telescope had even fallen down until he walked outside that evening to go home and realized the telescope was flying on top of the building. So thankfully not the catastrophe that it could have been. Although that's one of the reasons why telescopes are now remotely operated. Since it wasn't a catastrophe, even though it could have been, thankfully it didn't turn out to be a bad situation, but we didn't want to risk that happening again. That collapse was during 1988, and it was 2 years later, during 1990, that we got a phone call from West Virginia Senator Robert C. Byrd, and he said, "I heard about your telescope that fell down. That's too bad. Would you like a new one?" We said, "Yes, please." So he went to work securing the money to begin building the GBT. Construction began on the GBT in 1990, and it took 10 years to construct. It was completed on August 25th, 2000. That was the day it was dedicated. And we've been running the GBT ever since. Now the price tag for the GBT came up to between $95 and $100 million. Alright, so I wanted to mention a few weather conditions that the GBT will endure. So often I'm asked the question about weather, So whether rain or shine will affect if the GBT can observe or not. Well, rain or shine does not really make a lot of difference. Since we're dealing with radio waves, it doesn't really matter whether the skies are that clear or not, as long as we're not dealing with our faintest frequencies. Now, some of those really faint frequencies can't make it through atmospheric moisture, so even on a humid day, we would not be able to pick those up. So as far as that's concerned, in the summertime, it really does not matter whether it's rainy or whether it's shiny, because we will not be able to get those faint signals anyhow. There are some stronger signals, though, that we can observe plenty of in the summertime. Now, in the wintertime, when the skies are nice and clear and there's not a lot of moisture in the atmosphere, that's when we'll do that observing for those really faint signals. Now, besides that, in the wintertime, we will get a bunch of snow accumulation from time to time, so we just have to dump it out of the dish occasionally. We tilt the dish forward, and the front tip comes down to only 12 feet off of the ground. That snow slides right out. We just have to be careful to point it away from the warehouse so we don't bury our warehouse until spring. It gets struck by lightning about 5 to 7 times every year, which doesn't hurt the telescope, but it does scramble the data, although we're not going to argue with nature. If the wind is blowing harder than 35 miles per hour, we park the dish horizontal to the ground, so it's not like a giant sail up in the air. But other than that, it runs rain or shine, day or night. Alright, so we're back up at the 140-foot telescope here. Today the 140-foot is actually being rented by a group of Russian astronomers, and those astronomers are using this as a downlink station. They have a satellite called Spectre R that's orbiting Earth currently, and that satellite has a radio telescope attached to it. So they're doing the same thing that we're doing, but they're doing it from outer space, which means they get very clear astronomy data. They're not dealing with a lot of the RFI, the interference that we deal with here on Earth. But the downside is that now their data is floating around on a satellite in outer space. So to get their data back down to Earth where they can study it, they actually have that satellite transmit the data to the 140-foot. There's also a telescope in Moscow, Russia that they use as well. And so once they computerize that data, they can study it and share it with the astronomy world. So that's kind of a cutting-edge project that's going on currently in the astronomy community. Well, their interest is everything that our interest is, just discovering what's in outer space. Alright, so on the way back, I said I'd mention a few sources of local interference. When we send out our trucking truck, we really never know what we're going to find. One time a fella's electric toothbrush got a loose wire in it. The toothbrush still worked just fine, so he had no idea there was anything wrong at all. But the loose wire was sending out much stronger signals than it should have, and so we were picking those up with our telescopes here. He was just a few miles up the road. Boy, was he surprised when we showed up at his house one evening, and we bought him a brand new toothbrush. There was also a farmer a couple miles up the road a few years ago whose electric fence sent us signals when the grass would touch the fence and would amplify those signals, and we could pick them up. So we figured that out. We asked him if we had permission to go onto his property, and we did. And so about once a week, one of our maintenance guys would gather up a lawnmower, go down to his property, and just mow all of the fence lines on his property. I have to say, though, my favorite story is way before my time, but the Department of Wildlife around here decided to study flying squirrels. So they gathered up a bunch of flying squirrels, put radio tracking collars on them, and set them loose in the national forest to see where they'd go. Well, the upside is we figured out we have really great flying squirrel habitats here in Green Bank because they all chose to live right here. But the downside is it took 6 months for all the batteries in their tracking collars to die. The cemetery that's off to our left is where we buried the people who didn't turn off their cell phones. Just kidding. That's the Arborville Community Cemetery. Actually, that cemetery is not on observatory property. It's just bordering our property. For locals like myself whose families have been around since the Irish migration, it's actually a place where we have several generations of friends and family buried. And the cemetery itself is older than the observatory is. Alrighty, we are back outside of the gates. Feel free to turn on your electronics if you'd like to, and you can use your digital cameras again. Thank you for having those powered off. The building right now on our left is our machine shop. It's a bunch of old windows and equipment. Now, that machine shop is where our machinists will actually build telescope receiver equipment. We are